of our series around building Microsoft Sentinel integrations. As mentioned, today's topic is going to be around creating codeless connectors, which is a very challenging topic. And so our hopes today are to make it a little bit easier for you, give you some good examples and some good content. Just as an intro, my name is Matt Lowe, Senior Product Manager here at Microsoft for the Microsoft Sentinel product. And I'm joined today with a colleague, Javier. If you want to come off mute and give a quick introduction.
Hello, everyone. Yes, Javier Soriano here, a principal PM in the same team as Matt.
Awesome. And with that, let's get started. So just to highlight the agenda for today's session, it's going to be a lot of content, a lot of information at you over the next hour. So we're going to be covering what connectors are in the Codeless Connector platform, different methods for bringing data into Microsoft Sentinel, the different avenues that we offer today. And then we will start getting into the meat and potatoes of the topic around how to build your own connector with the Codeless Connector platform. So we'll talk about polling, data collection, the different components from Azure Monitor that we leverage, connector interface, and creating the ARM template itself. We'll give some highlights and examples of how to parse and when to parse your data when creating a codeless connector. And we're going to highlight some other considerations that come into play while you're going through this process. So I will advise you, put on your sunscreen, your snorkel, grab your flotation devices, because this is a bit of a deep topic. It's going to be a lot of information coming at you over the next hour. So if you feel a little overwhelmed, it's totally understandable. That's why this is recorded. And that's why we're doing this, is to make this process a lot easier. So getting into this, if you haven't already built a codeless connector in the past, here's some recommended knowledge that we advise getting familiar with before you start. So in this case, JSON basics, knowing how to make an ARM template through JSON, running API calls through REST API, as this is going to be a key component and key process to testing your API calls and also getting the data response from what you want to build. Having some familiarity with API tools such as Postman or Bruno, basically making it easier for you to test those REST API calls mentioned in the previous point. We recommend knowing the Azure Monitor log ingestion API, data collection rule, data collection endpoint platform. Those different components do come into play with this new version of the Codeless Connector platform. And lastly, it's always good to know Custo, so we recommend getting familiar with Custo query language, at least some of the basics. So let's jump into the different types of data connectors and data ingestion methods that we have today. To start off, we have just a simple diagram, and this is going to transition and be animated over as we speak. But we have the core components here for data ingestion for Microsoft Sentinel. We have the Azure Log Analytics workspace with Microsoft Sentinel on top of it, within an Azure environment that's tied to a Microsoft Entra ID tenant. As we build out and start populating this environment, we have things like virtual machines, Azure services with diagnostic logs, and native connectors to the Microsoft ecosystem, all of which can be brought into the Log Analytics workspace and be fed into Microsoft Sentinel. As we start to go outside of the Azure ecosystem, that's where we start to look at on-prem resources, other cloud platforms, other cloud services, such as like a SaaS. And so you start getting into more of the custom options of data collection. So as we can see, syslog, Ceph, using other tools other than our built-in agents such as Logstash, Cribble, and it keeps going on and on. You've got your custom applications, you've got your threat intelligence vendors, all of which are available today to be brought into Microsoft Sentinel through the various options that we have today, like API, agent, and file collection. But let's get into where codeless connectors come into play for this. So you might be asking yourself, if you're not familiar, what exactly is a codeless connector? In this case, a codeless connector is a polling as a service infrastructure resource within the Azure platform that allows you to bring in and customize how you bring in data. No requirements for service installations. It's just a simple ARM template. No coding is needed, so this goes back to the points about knowing JSON. So if you're familiar with JSON, you can build a codeless connector as it is just an ARM template, as you'll see later on in the demos. And a great part about this is that it has built-in health monitoring through diagnostic settings. So we're able to monitor the performance of a codeless connector as it's running. And the best part, there's no additional cost to use them. Even though you are deploying a polling connector on Azure, the only cost that's generated is for the data that you're ingesting into the log analytics workspace. So no licensing, no resource purchasing, just deploy and pay for the data that you're bringing in. Now, you might be wondering, okay, I've heard of codeless connectors in the past. What exactly is different about it now versus back then? And if you're somebody who took that leap and started building codeless connectors in the past, you'll be able to pick up on the differences that we introduced. But just for the sake of clarity, we have what is referring to as the legacy version or version 1. This was the codeless connector platform that leveraged the Azure Log Analytics legacy HTTP data collector API, which this is going to be deprecated in 2026. This also used the combination of the Azure Log Analytics Workspace ID and key in order to authenticate and send data to the workspace. Lastly, it's still being used by some old data connectors. You'll see some of the either old original codeless connectors out there or Azure function-based connectors out there. These are all seen as the legacy version of the codeless connector platform. With the newer version, the current version that's out today, this new version leverages the newer key components for data ingestion and data collection through Azure Monitor. So this is going to use the newer Azure Monitor Ingestion API. It's going to leverage Entra ID for authentication, so OAuth 2, in order to manage those permissions. It's going to leverage new pipeline architecture through the data collection endpoints and data collection rules features offered through Azure Monitor. This is also going to open up the option for ingestion time transformation. So if you want to normalize the data as it's coming in or make some modifications to the payload that you're ingesting, that is supported with the current version. And lastly, it supports multiple endpoints and multiple destination tables. So if you're looking to create one table or one connector, I should say, to collect multiple data sources from a platform, that can be done today with the newer version.
Thanks, Matt. So yeah, so for this webinar, we're going to focus only in this version 2, in the current version. Other things that we're going to be talking about, the different options for the different bits and bytes of the configuration. Again, it's going to be only the current version, version 2. The recommendation is not to use version 1 because, as Matt said, the HTTP data collector API that is using is going to be deprecated in 2026. Okay, CCP supports 3 different ingestion methods. One is from REST API, so you can point to an external third-party REST API endpoint and be able to bring data from that. But it also supports 2 other ingestion methods. One is using Amazon Web Services S3 buckets, and another one is using GCP PubSub subscriptions. For today, we're going to focus on REST API only, but our intention is to do a webinar in a few months where we will cover also AWS S3 buckets and GCP PubSub in detail. Okay, so let's answer this question. How do you define a CCP connector? So at the end, it's just an ARM template, right? You define a CCP connector through an ARM template that you deploy in the Azure platform. Actually, when you deploy your Content Hub solutions that have data connectors, they also have behind an ARM template that is deployed behind the scenes, so you don't have to worry about doing the manual work. But when we're creating our own custom CCP connector, we will have to build that template and then deploy it in the Azure portal. What is contained inside that ARM template? First of all, we have to define the polling configuration. This defines how CCP authenticates to that third-party external API endpoint and queries that API to get the data from it. Then we have to define what is the schema of the data as it's coming in from that third-party service, right? So basically, what is the format of the response that I get from that API? And then any ingestion time transformations that I might need to do, right? So do I need to transform the data so it matches what log analytics supports or expects? So that's what we're going to be finding this data collection rule component. Then we have to define the table. So this is where the data is going to be written in the workspace, right? And that has a schema, right? So I have to define that schema of the data within the workspace so it matches what I need, right? What I want. And lastly, I'm going to need to also define the connector user interface. So how is it going to be the look and feel of that connector in the connector gallery in my Sentinel environment? So now in the rest of the webinar, we're going to go into each of these components in detail, defining or explaining how this is done. Okay, let's start with polling. So before I get into an example, so I'm going to try to teach you how to build your own connector using an example with a specific third-party product that I use, which is Box. But before I go into that example and hands-on experience or hands-on examples, I'm going to tell you a little bit of theory, right? So the first thing that I was talking about is polling, right? So what are the building blocks of this polling definition? First of all, I need to define what is the authentication that I'm going to use. So how CCP is going to authenticate against that endpoint. Then I need to define how the request is going to be. So how CCP is going to request the data. It's going to use a specific URL. Does it need to specify a specific time window to get the data? Does it need to retry every now and then, or how many times it needs to retry the API call if it fails? Any additional parameters that I need to provide? All these things are going to be within the request part of the polling. I need to also define the response. So within that API response that I get from my endpoint, what parts are important for Sentinel, right? What part of the data I need to bring into Sentinel? What is the format that is being brought into? Is it JSON? Is it CSV? Is it something else? Is there compression that as part of that? Is it gzip or no compression? So we'll have to define those details. Pagination. So this is when the response is too large, right? So if the response is too large to fit in a single response from the API, how that API breaks it down into smaller pieces, into smaller chunks, right? So that is also a definition that I have to provide to CCP so it understands how that external API works in terms of pagination. And lastly, I have to define the data collection rule, right? So this is basically what we will get the data into Sentinel, get the data, and then do some transformations, and then push it into the table in the workspace. So let's see how this is done. First of all, let's talk about what authentication types we support today in Sentinel. This slide, as you can see, has a hyperlink there where it goes into the documentation. Our documentation contains a reference of all the different things that we support. But I wanted to explain a little bit here so you understand firsthand. First of all, we support basic authentication. This is just username and password, right? And this is the way you define in the JSON. As you can see, it's an auth, it's a base specific property called auth. And then you just specify the type basic, username, password. Quite simple, right? Then we also support API key, right? An identifier and a key. This is the way in which you codify that into the template, into the REST API configuration. Just type API key, the API key specifically, and the name that we need to provide for that API key. And then we have also OAuth2, right? There's two types of OAuth2 support that we provide, authorization code and client credentials. So you define this in this specific way. Again, I'm not going to go into the whole details of how all these properties are defined, but you have everything in that document, right? In this document that I have here at the top, which I will review in a second, we will have all these different definitions. But just to give you a little bit of a run through, I'm going to put my laser here, and you see that the grant type is where you define the type of auth2, in this case, client credentials. You define the client ID and client secret, in this case, the token endpoint. So what is the URL that I need to go to request the token? If there's any headers required, and any additional parameters, and also the scope. What is the scope that I'm going to get or that I should get from that API so I can perform my different activities. Lastly, we also support JSON Web Tokens, or JWT. This is something that we recently added. It's now already in our documentation, so you can go there and take a look. So you can define also the JSON Web Tokens. I didn't add an example here, but it's just similar to this. Again, go to that reference document to find all the different fields available for each of the options, and also examples on each of them. Let's talk about pagination a bit as well. So first, before we talk about pagination, we need to basically ask ourselves a question, right? Or ask that external API a question, so we can determine what is the type of pagination that we need. So we support 3 different types of paginations. One is when the API has a link to the next or previous pages, right? So when we have this, if the API from that third party contains in the response a link to the next page, then we use one of these options, right? You'll see in the documentation when one is better than the other. They're slightly different, but in general, we use these 3 types when the API response has a link to the next or previous page. The next one is, does the API response have a token or cursor for the next and previous pages? In those cases, we have these 2 different pagination types, next page token or persistent token. Again, in the documentation, you can see the whole extent of that. And lastly, the last method of pagination that we support is if the API has a parameter for the number of objects that I have to skip when I'm doing the pagination, right? With this, it would be offset. So yeah, these are the different pagination types. I think let's go a little bit just for a second to show you the different documentation where you can see the different pagination types. Let me open that really quick. And here you can see, right, this is the article where you will see the different options. Again, this is for pagination. You'll see another section also for authentication. If I go to the top and I go to authentication, you will see here the authentication options that I mentioned: basic, API key, Auth2, and JWT. So here, as I said, explains the different fields available for each of them, from the simple basic to API key to Auth2 that has more options, as you can see, to also JWT configuration options, right? And the same for all the different parts of the request, right, that I need to define. Okay, going back. These are some examples of pagination in the JSON configuration or JSON codification for offset, for next page token, and for link header, right? This would be the way in which you define these pagination types. Again, everything that you need to know about this, go to this REST API Poller reference documentation. It contains all the details that you need to know about the different fields. This is just a sample API polling, right? This is from a specific third-party vendor, Netscope, that supports API token option, right? So let's try to break it down into smaller pieces. So first of all, this is where this is the type of resource, the Azure resource that contains the configuration for the polling. The data connector resource type, right? As you can see here, is operational insights, workspaces, providers, data connectors. Then you have to define the kind of data connector. If you're working with our external API, with the REST API, you define it as REST API Poller, as you can see. But I here also mentioned that if you're using GCP, you would put here in the kind GCP or Amazon Web Services S3 in the case of Amazon S3 packets. Okay, but in this case, as we're talking to an API, external API, we just used kind REST API Poller. Then we define here the authentication, right? So this is the authentication type API key. In this case, the name of the key itself is called Netscope API token. And then here you just put your API key, right? And it would be the authentication in this case would be configured just with this little JSON file. Then we define the request, right? So which is the endpoint in this case, the API endpoint that I need to request the data from? In this case, this one, right? API v2/events. Then I define how often do I want to query that endpoint. In this case, it's 5 minutes. And what is the method that I need to use, the HTTP method that I need to use to request? In this case is get, right? Normally it's going to be get. In some cases it might be post, but normally it's going to be get, right? And then I need to define the response. So what part of the response from the API I need to get to ingest into Sentinel? In this case, it was a property called result that contains an array of events. And lastly, I define the pagination. So in this case, there's a specific parameter that is called next that will contain what I need to go to the next page, right? To go to the next chunk of data that I need to retrieve. Yeah, so just in general, these are the high-level steps that are going to be involved when you have to write or have to define your own connector. First of all, you're going to need to research the data source API, right? So you're going to have to invest some time into going into the documentation of that third-party API, see how it works from the different points of views, authentication, pagination, etc. So that's the first step. Then you will define the REST API poller. That little JSON struct that we just saw, that's the REST API poller. We will define that part. You then need to define the data collection rule and the destination table. Okay, that's, as I mentioned before, the data collection rule is just the input schema and the transformation, and the destination table is how the schema looks like in the workspace. Then we define the connector interface, and when we create the template, right? This is going to be an iterative process, right? It's not going to be something that you do perfectly fine and you just have the final template at the first attempt. You're going to have to do an iterative, improvement on how you do the template. For example, in the first part of in the first template that you get, maybe you don't use parameters, or maybe you don't use pagination. You might not need pagination at the beginning, right? You might just want to get the data without pagination, just to verify that you're doing the right thing in the configuration, right? And then you add more and more features as you continue, as you progress. Okay, so the first thing that you do, as I said, is the data source API research. So again, we need to ask ourselves, or we need to ask the API these different things. How to authenticate with the API? What is the endpoint that I need to get the logs from? How the pagination works? How the response looks like? I need to generate sample traffic, right? Because if I don't have traffic, I'm not going to see anything in my response, right? So if I'm working with a blank kind of third-party system, I'm going to need to generate some traffic, like creating some files, deleting some files, creating some users, things like that. So I see some data to be able to interact with it. And at the end, you're going to have to test with your favorite API client. You can use Postman, you can use Bruno, you can use whatever you want. You can use curl if you're a hardcore Linux user, but you're going to have to use an API client to test these things, right? In some cases, you might see in the Content Hub an existing Azure Function Connector, as I said here at the bottom, right? If that's the case, you can even look at the code of that Azure function to, inspire yourself on how to do the polling from that third-party system. So again, these are the questions that we need to answer. How to authenticate with API? What is the endpoint to get the logs to? How the pagination works? How the response looks like? And generate sample traffic. And again, testing with the API. Again, this is just, we're doing the polling only, right? So we're just configuring the polling part of my ARM template. Let's do a demo on how I would do this for my box environment. 1 second. Okay. So in the case of Box, they have a very good documentation, right? I would just go into my favorite search engine and then search for Box developer guides, right? Developing guides or API guides, right? And you will find this. It's a very comprehensive documentation. And something jumps to me at the beginning, right? First of all, authentication. I need to know how to authenticate against this API. I can see that it supports Auth2, JWT, and client credentials. Fantastic. So any of these would actually work with CCP. So I can just choose whichever I want, right? In my case, I'm going to use client credentials because I think it's easy. Once I go into that, it's going to tell me how it works, right? So what are the different things that I need to put in the request to get a token, to get authorized by that system, right? It's telling me that I need to say, okay, grant type, it's client credentials. I need to specify box subject type is enterprise, and box subject ID. I need to provide an enterprise ID. This is something that you get from the box system, right? So this is great. I see all this. This is how you do the request with curl. Okay, cool. So I just need to provide these headers, and then I need to provide all these different things in parameters, right? Seems like. And this is the URL that I need to specify. Cool. I know how to do it, but I need to know how to set it up, right? So here in this other article, it's explaining me what I need to do. I'm not going to go into the whole process because, again, this is very specific to Box, and you're going to be doing it for something else. But here it tells you how to create your app, right? An app to connect to the Box system. In this case, telling me, hey, create your app, select what authentication method you want. In this case, we want client credentials grant, and so on and so forth, right? I have done already all these steps, and I have already an app that contains a client ID and a client secret. I think that I can actually show you that here. Yeah, I have my Sentinel client credentials application, which contains some configuration, a client ID, a client secret that is hidden for security, and it needs the access. It has the access that it needs, right? So again, going back to how I need to build the request that is here, I'm gonna try and do it with Postman. So let me jump to Postman. So I'm here with Postman. When I'm doing what it was said in the documentation from Box, right? Use this URL to do a post request with these different parameters with these different things in the body, right? Grant type, client credentials, the client ID. I obviously hid this as a variable, client secret, Box object type is enterprise, and the enterprise ID. If I send this post request, I should get here, my access token. So now I have an access token that I can use to query my Box environment, right? So this is quite useful for me. The great thing that you can do with Postman is that it allows you to just do it instead of having to do the raw request. You can just use the authentication type here, auth2, right? As you can see, it supports authentication auth2, and then you specify what you want exactly. In my case, I want client credentials, grant type. I specified the access token URL, the client ID, client secret, and then the additional parameters that I may need, the Box subject type, enterprise, and the Box subject ID, which is my enterprise ID, right? So if I do this query already, I should be able to get some data. And I do. So, but how did you get the data? Okay, let me go back to Box, because we just saw the authentication part, right? So this is great. But following with the second question that we had in that slide, I have to check what is the endpoint that I need to query, right? So let's go and investigate that. So if we go back to the documentation, we're going to see that I have one specific endpoint that is events, right? And this is what I need, right? I need to get events to ingest them into Sentinel. So my security teams can, alert based on those events and so forth. Immediately, what catches my eye here is that I need enterprise events, right? I'm trying to get events from Box for my organization. I don't want to get specific events for just a user. I want to get enterprise events so I can analyze what is happening with that Box environment, right? And here it tells me a little bit how to do that, right? It gives me the API endpoint, which is 2.0 events. And then I have to provide some parameters. It tells me that there's two stream types, admin logs and admin log streaming. I think for me, it's enough the admin logs. So I'm ready to do that, right? So that's what I did basically in Postman. In that request, I just used that URL that they're telling me, right? API box.com 2.0 events and the stream type admin logs. And as you can see, I'm getting already events, right? Fantastic. The third question that I was putting in that slide is pagination. So if I go back to here to the Box documentation, I can see here that there is some stream position pagination for this endpoint for events. And here it tells me that whenever I do an API query, an API call, I'm gonna get I can specify this stream position parameter, right, to indicate the system where I left off. How am I gonna know what is my next stream position? Well, it tells here that the API returns an empty list and next stream position, right? So this is the parameter that I need to actually take into account for my pagination. let's see, let's go to Postman and verify that. Oh, indeed, in my API response, as you can see, I got next stream position, right? That is right now, it has 100 events. If I use this specific number in here, you see I specify stream position in the parameter, and I just put that number, right, that I got from the API, and I do a request. I think I should get, oh, I get 4 new events. Okay, so it seems like since the time I did the last call, there were 4 new events, right? Let's see if I can run more than the system, generating the events, and I can get the next page. Oh, the next page is 0. So it means that I finished, right? I have pulled everything that I can. So pagination is working perfectly, right? Just according to the documentation from Box, I got everything that I need. So again, as you can see, I was able to find in the documentation the authentication type, the pagination, what is the endpoint that I need to query, and all of those things. So now I'm ready to build my REST API Polar JSON configuration. So let's go back to the presentation. Okay, this is the Polar that I have to create. First, with authentication, as we saw, we need to specify auth2 client credentials. This is the token, right? api.box.com auth2 token. And I need to specify these 2 parameters, right? The box subject type enterprise and the box subject ID and the ID. At the beginning, if you want, you can hard code these values, right? You can hard code the client secret, you can hard code the client ID, you can hard code the box enterprise ID, just for testing, obviously. We will show you later how to parameterize these different things so it's more secure. Next, I have request. As I saw, this is the endpoint that I need to request, 2.0 events. There was an additional parameter that I could specify here. I didn't specify it here, but normally you would do that. And then again, a get request, which is what I did, and then some default values. Not sure if you noticed, but the array of data that I needed to get was under a property called entries. Let me go 1 second to Postman to show you that, right? If I remove the stream position and I do again the API call, you see that there's an entries array that contains all the different things that I need to know, right? So each of these things between curly brackets are the different events that are going to be ingested in Sentinel. So at the end, what I need to know is that the array under entries is what I need to ingest. So that's what I define in here, $.entries, okay? And lastly, the pagination. Again, in the JSON path, so the specific thing, the specific property in the JSON response that I need to grab is next stream position, okay? And the way that I specify that in the next request, the next page parameter name is stream underscore position, right? So this is how I define it. Okay, so we have our REST API Polar. So this is all that we needed to do to pull data successfully from Box. Fantastic. Let's go to the next step. As we said, the next step is to create the data collection rule and the destination table. So how do I do this? So first of all, to me, the easiest way to do this is just to grab the output from the API response. The part that I need, in my case, the array, that array and their entries, right? Then you follow the custom logs DCR wizard, the data collection rule wizard that we have in the log analytics experience. I will show you a demo of this, no worries. Then you add any transformations that you might need, right? For that, take into account that every single table in log analytics and in Sentinel needs to have the time generated field defined, right? This obviously should contain always the time when the event was created in the source system, right? You could make time generated equals now, like the time when the event is ingested in Sentinel. That's not ideal because it doesn't really reflect when the event was generated. Okay, so ideally you will grab some kind of timestamp in the response to be mapped with this time generated field. Also, watch out for field names that are reserved. Things like type, title. These field names will not be valid. So log analytics will actually show an error if you try to use these types of these field names, right? Start with a simple transformation at the beginning. At the beginning, it doesn't have to be perfect. You don't need to do any advanced parsing or anything. You can just leave a very simple transformation to make it work. And in the last iteration, you can probably adapt or adopt one of the naming conventions that we have, which is start with capital letters, the column names, and do not use any delimiters, right? For example, created at or event type with an uppercase E and a T, an uppercase T, right? The fourth thing that you would do is that when you have already done that wizard, you will get a DCR. And that DCR is going to contain the structure, the JSON structure, JSON definition that you need to put in your ARM template. Lastly, you're going to have to get the format, the schema of the table that resulted, right? And that you can do it from this page. I will show you a demo in a second. Lastly, one recommendation about the table name. Normally, our recommendation is to have product and then the data type, for example, in my case, box events, underscore CL. You're always going to have a custom log table, right? Normally, you could ingest into some of our native tables, but for now, we're going to just keep it simple and talk about custom log tables. Important, as you can see in the last bullet there, if there's an existing table that was created by an Azure Function Connector, right? In my case, for example, there was a previous table called box events underscore CL. What I do is I append a V2 at the end, right? So in my case, it's going to be box events V2 underscore CL. Okay. All right. So let's see how we do this. Let me go to this other page in the portal. So I'm now in the Azure environment. I'm in my CCP webinar workspace, and I want to follow this process, right? I want to grab the output from the API and follow the wizard. I have to go to tables, first of all, in my workspace. And then I need to create a custom log wizard. In this case, I have already, I think, a box table. Yes, so I'm going to create it with a different name, but let's do it. New custom log, DCR based. This is what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to give it the table a name. In this case, it's going to be box events demo. Okay. I specify a data collection rule. I'm going to create a new data collection rule. This is going to be called CCP webinar box demo. And then a data collection input. This is not important. This can be any that is in the same region as the DCR. It's fine. Okay. Now it's asking me to upload a JSON file with the format from the response, right? Where do I have that? Easy. I have it here, right? I just have to grab this array. Important to include the square bracket at the beginning and at the end. In this case, I have 100 records, so I already did that, and I have already a sample file. But by the end, it's just getting all these different events into a JSON file. It's nice to get as many events as possible. Why? Because I'm going to get a bigger sample of different event types, right? And that will help me do a better transformation, a better mapping, right? In any case, as I said, I have already my file. So I'm going to browse for files. And this is my box events.json file that contains a sample. Ooh, OK, perfect. It tells me that, it's bringing all these columns, source, created by, created at, event ID, blah, blah, blah. But it's telling me here an error, right? Time-generated field is not found in the sample provided. Please use transformation editor to populate the time-generated column in the destination table. OK, let's do it. So if I open up transformation editor, it will be basically a KQL dialog where I can do this transformation. So the first thing, as it said, I'm going to extend time generated equals, I know there's a field that contains the time, right, which was created at, right? This field contains a timestamp. So I'm going to just use that, create at. And then I'm going to just remove that field that I don't need anymore, right? Created at. OK, I run this query. Now I have my time generated field. Fantastic. I can apply it. But oof, look, I see that there is a specific column named type. Why did I say in that slide that type is not a valid name? So I'm going to have to change that. If I went ahead and tried to apply this, it would throw an error saying just that. But I'm going to just do it in advance. So I'm going to create another field that is going to be called event underscore type. And I'm going to make it equals to type, right? And then I'm going to also remove type. OK, and then I run this query. Perfect. It all looks good. Now I can just click next and create that DCR, that data collection rule. This will take a few seconds, but after that, I will have a data collection rule that I can just grab and use for my CCP template, right? And of course, a new table here as well. So first, I'm going to go and grab that data collection rule. So if I go to data collection rules and I type here box, which one is the one that I created? I think I need to refresh. Oh, here, CCP webinar box demo. This is it. And I just have here in the JSON view, sorry, did that too quick. Here in JSON view on the right, you see that I have the full JSON definition that I need, right? So I'm going to need pretty much everything under properties. Immutable ID, I don't need it, but data collection endpoint, I'm going to need a parameter. I can then parameterize this later, but I will need this specific thing. I have the whole stream declaration. This is perfect. I need all this, the data sources, the destinations, and the data flows. The data flows is what contains my transformation. You see, this is the transformation that I want to use, and also the target table, box events demo _CL. Perfect. So I'm going to grab this because I'm going to need it to build my CCP template. Okay. What was the next step? Get the table, right? Get the table schema, right? Again, we see that this box events demo _CL. So I'm going to use this specific page in the Azure documentation. This page is tables get. When you click here, try it, you will be able to just do an API call against this API call specifically to get tables. And then I just need to provide the specific resources group name, which in my case is CCP webinar. Build environment is my subscription ID. I need to specify the right table, the workspace, the API version, all good, and areas just run. Well, I expire my authentication, so I need to do it again, right? So when you don't authenticate properly, you need to do it again. So let's do it. I was hoping that the authentication was still there, but I have to do it again. That's okay. So again, CCP webinar. I need to select my subscription. The table is this one. The workspace is this one. Oops, sorry, it's CCP webinar. Okay, and I can just do now the run, right? And I get now at 200, perfect. And now I see this is the table definition. So again, I will need all these things for my ARM template, right? This contains all the different custom columns and standard columns as well, right? Perfect, so I have those two things. I'm ready to build my DCR and my table. Let's go back to the presentation and continue to the next step. I did this already. Cool. Next step is to define the connector interface. So this is, again, as I said, just to define the look and feel of how the connector is going to look like in the connectors gallery in Sentinel. I have to define three things: basics, permissions, and instruction steps. Let's take a look at each of them. So these are the basics. This is this part in the Sentinel screen, right? Where you see the name, the provider, the status, content source version, things like that. So let's break it down step by step. This is the title, right? This is how you define it. The publisher, that's right there. The description markdown, right? So this is an example of a data connector, perfect. The graph queries, this is what defines how the graph looks like. I have the data types, which is the tables at the bottom, right here. And the connectivity criteria, which tells Sentinel when to light up in green this connector. In the case of CCP, always you have to use has data connectors as the specific connectivity criteria. Okay, as you can see here, I also use within here this parameter, graph queries table name. I use it in other places, right? I just have to reference this between two curly brackets, and I'll be able to use this same table name everywhere, right? So this is to make it easier for us to use. Okay, so this is the basics. Let's now look at the prerequisites. Prerequisites is what things I need as a user to be able to connect this connector. In this case, I need two things. First of all, you need permissions on a specific provider, right? In this case, a workspace provider. So I define that here, resource provider. The Microsoft Operational Insights Workspaces is the permission that I need, and I need to be able to write, read, and delete, right? These are the permissions that I define. And if for whatever reason I don't have all these permissions, I will see here a red cross, right, a red X, telling me that I don't have the required permissions to do this. And then I also define any custom things that I need. In this case, I need a Box API client and client secret and the enterprise ID, right? So I define that as a custom type of requirement or prerequisite, so the customer can see that. And finally, I define what are the different things that I need to inject to connect to my specific Box environment, right? How do I do that? So these three first boxes, I capture the token endpoint, right? As a placeholder, as a default, I have this one, which is the one that I used in the demo earlier. I specify the activity endpoint, the events activity endpoint, which is this one, the enterprise ID with a placeholder, and then I can use what we call an auth form, right? This auth form basically will ask you for two things: client ID and client secret. Excuse me. There. So also I put in the chat, sorry, in the chat. I also mentioned here that these parameters that you define here, these names for these text boxes, are important because these are going to be used later in the REST API poller. Okay, so pay attention to these names that you provide, because this is the parameter name that is going to take the token endpoint, the token, sorry, the API endpoint, the enterprise ID, and so forth. I have here put here in the slide the link to also the documentation that comes with that brings all the different instruction types that we support. I'm going to open it up for just 1 second, but you can see this is the auth form that we use, text boxes, connection toggle buttons, copyable labels, and so on and so forth. Okay, and then details about each of them. So you're completely covered with this reference. Cool. So the fourth step is then now create the CCP ARM template, right? So up to now, I have defined again my polling. I have defined my DCR and my table, and I have defined also the UI, the connector interface, user interface. So now I'm left with just creating the ARM template, which is putting all of this together in a single JSON file, right? We have some guidance. We have here, as you can see, follow the steps here to build a template. I'm going to show you in a second how to do that. There's going to be comments in that template that will indicate you where you need to change things, right? So you're not completely lost with a huge template. You will be able to just see where you need to change things to make it adapt to your specific connector that you're developing. You will have to modify variables as well to the specific table names, connector names, solution name, and so forth. And then you just need to insert your specific connector interface that we just defined, the table and DCR that you saw how we get it, and then the REST API poller config, which you also saw with the authentication, with the pagination, request, response, etc. Okay, so let's do a demo of this. Sorry. Let me go to this specific article that shows me how to build my ARM template, right? Here, what it tells me is that I need to copy several sections, one after the other, to build my whole template. I'm going to do it live with you. I'm going to open my Visual Studio Code. I'm going to open a new file, and I'm going to do it with you. So first thing, I need to copy this bit, which contains the schema, parameters, and that's it. So I'm just copying this, and I paste it. Perfect. Next is this section that goes in here. So I delete this comment, and I go to the next. Okay, the next part is variables. Perfect. I go and I put the variables. I will worry later about commenting or about changing all these things that have comments. But for now, let's keep going. Next is the resources section. Okay, let's go. Resources, cool. And here it tells me what it contains: content templates, data connector definitions, some metadata, content packages, etc. So again, I'm going to copy this guy, and I'm going to put it in here. Perfect. There's another section with resources here. Perfect. By the way, I didn't mention, but in the previous one, in the previous section, I have here the DCR, right? This is the DCR definition and the table definition. Fantastic. Okay, resources number 3 section. Next, cool, is this one. So metadata. Here, I'm not going to have to modify anything, I believe. So we're good. And then resources section number 4. Perfect. This is where I will include, by the way, the REST API poller, right? You see all this part that is commented out. I need to be able to, I need to provide the definition of my REST API poller over here. And lastly, I think last one already is this last part, which is, yeah, the resource section 5 content packages. Perfect, and that's the end. I'm done. I think actually I have to remove this last curly bracket, and I'm done. This is my whole template. Now comes the part where I need to provide, where I need to fill out all these different things that are in comments, right? But I should be able to do it, right? I already have my polling, as we saw with Box. I already have my connector UI. I already have my DCR, and I already have my table. Those are the core things that I'm gonna need. Okay. Cool. Okay. One important thing that I wanted to mention is that you're gonna see this specific part where we have content templates and a content kind called resources data connector. In here, you're going to have to also touch the parameters part. These parameters over here. For Box, I needed to provide my parameters, right? Box enterprise ID, the client ID, the client secret, and so forth. These two, you shouldn't need to add. But here you will need to add the parameters that are coming from the UI, right? Here I removed the token endpoint and the API endpoint because I didn't need them anymore. That was an earlier version of the connector. In this last version, I just needed these three parameters, right? Client secret, client ID, and Box enterprise ID. These parameters coming from the connector UI definition will also be used in the REST API poller, right? It's important. As I said in the beginning, you don't need to use parameters. And it will work just to show you that data is coming through, but you're going to have to do it at the end to make it more secure and make it more scalable, right? And this is how it's going to look like. In the REST API poller, it's going to look like this. The client secret is going to be a parameter, okay? Note that you have to use this notation to square brackets, right? To reference that we're referencing a parameter from the previous step, from the previous content template. The same for client ID, the same for my Box enterprise ID, and the same for the data collection endpoint and immutable data collection rule immutable ID. These you don't need to modify because they will be already there in the data collection. Sorry, in the sample ARM template, right? As you can see, I hard coded here the endpoint for the token, so I'm good with that. Okay. All right. Let's do an end-to-end deployment demo. For this, I think I have a video, but I think let's try to do it live. So this is my full JSON template from for Box, right? Where I have my parameters, I have my variables. If I go down, I will see my DCR, data collection rule. Again, this is the things that I defined together with you today in the demo, right? With the input schema, with the target workspace, and with the transformation. Right, this is exactly what I did with you, right? And then the table, the target table that it goes into. Then the table itself, okay, where I define the columns that table is going to have. Fantastic. Then I define the connector UI config, right? With Box events, the sample queries, what is the table. Then I'm going to define the permissions, right? That I need permissions to the workspace, that I need some specific custom permissions for Box, for the API, and then some instruction steps, right? With, in this case, I put 3 descriptions and some additional things, right? So let me, instructions, perfect. The auth form, as we saw, very good. And then I have, this is the part that I think is, that I mentioned that is a little bit tricky, right? Content templates, content kind, resources data connector. This is what I need to specify the parameters, right? Client secret, client ID, Box enterprise ID, right? I have them there, perfect. And then the last thing that I need to define is the REST API poller, where I have my authentication, my request, my response, and my pagination. All good. So I'm going to show you now a video of how to deploy it because I have it already deployed. If not, it would fail. Okay, let me go to the slides. Here we go. Okay, I hope you can see my screen still. Let me go to the part where I left. I don't know why it was left there. Okay, let me go there and show you the video. So here, go here to deploy a custom template. I just copy the whole template as it was. I go into deploy a custom template. I just paste the whole thing. I save it. I fill out the parameters. In this case, I'm going to deploy in my CCP webinar resource group and my CCP webinar workspace. North Europe is the location. Good. And the workspace name, as we said, is CCP webinar. Okay. And I just review and create. This creation is very, very fast. It takes just a couple of seconds to complete, and you will have basically the connector created. There it is. It's completed, and I just go now to Sentinel. Go to my data connectors section, and I have there now my new box event CCP connector. If I just open that connector page, I will be able to just provide the information that I need, which is the enterprise ID, the client ID, and the client secret. I copy paste my values, and I just click connect. This connection takes a few seconds, like 30 seconds or so. So you have to wait a bit, and then it will show you connected. If there's any error, you might have to research a little bit more. Sometimes you did wrong the mapping between the source schema, the input schema, and the table. So you will need to do that, but normally it should be all good. All right, perfect. Important to mention, it comes with health monitoring, as we said, right? So once you have your data connector, make sure that you enable health monitoring. It is built in, and you have to enable, however, you have to enable it from the workspace. So you have here a link to show you how to enable health monitoring. That will populate a table called Sentinel Health, right? That will tell you, hey, is the data being pulled successfully or not? Before I go into Parsing, let me go a second to show you that health. So if I search for Sentinel Health, you will see that I'm pulling successfully from box, right? It's telling me that data fetched successfully from my Microsoft box event CCP connector, right? And I have the details there. And as you can see, I'm now getting data into my workspace, which is great news. Okay, let's now talk about parsing briefly. So why do we need parsing? First, because it masks the complexity of the data source, right? Sometimes the data source contains XML fields or JSON fields where it's difficult for the analyst to extract the value, right? So we can make it really easy for them if we just remove that complexity, mask it, and be able to make it simpler for them. It makes it also easier for extensibility, right? If I need to extend a specific data type or a schema, it's much easier to do it with a parser than just changing my DCR, my input schema, my transformation, right? It makes the analyst life easier, as I said, right? If they are able to understand better the data when they query it and not have to do additional tasks to extract data or fields from it, it's much easier for them. And lastly, it creates homogeneity with other schemas, right? If all your schemas look more or less the same, it will be much easier for you to interact with them. Imagine, for example, the typical IP address field. Sometimes it's called IP_address, sometimes it's called IP address, sometimes it's called IP-address. So if we have a common name for all these different schemas, it will be much easier, and that can be done through parsing. Some tips, whether we use query time or ingestion time. So query time is normally preferred if we don't expect performance issues. Query time obviously has a performance cost, right? Because the parsing is done when you query the data, right? And if the data is too large, there might be performance issues. If that's the case, we recommend using ingest time, as you can see below, where you can do the parsing. If it's more complex or expensive or extensive, you can do that. Taking into account that not every single KQL command or operator is supported with ingestion time transformations, but that's the recommendation. Lastly, if the solution content, like the rules, the hunting queries, workbooks, are normally written on top of a parser, right? So follow this rule as well, right? Write your parser, and then all the content that you create on top, use it or create it on top of the parser. If the connector that you're developing is from an existing solution that contains also a parser and content, we must modify that existing parser to include a new table. Why? Because that way, all the existing content, all the rules, hunting queries, workbooks, etc., will continue to work exactly the same. And I put here an example from Okta, where we have two versions, the function connector and the CCP connector, and we have a parser that joins both of them, right? So there's a specific trick to do it, and you will see that there. Just a very, very brief demo, because I know we're short on time, for Box, right? Again, these are my fields, my records from Box. They look good. I have some JSONs here, but again, the field names are not really aligned with what I'm used to see or what my analysts are used to see, right? So what do? I can create a parser like this one. This is just a parser that basically changes the names of the fields. If I run that, I'll be able to get a look and feel that is much better, right? My analyst will not have to go into a lot of different JSONs or XMLs or whatever it is in that case, and I'm able to see a very simple representation of my table, right? So this would be a good parser to implement in my environment. Okay, with that, Matt, back to you.
Yeah, I'll give your voice a little bit of a break there, Javier. Thanks for all that information there. Now, this kind of came up in one of the questions in the chat, but how do we go about securing a Codeless connector? We've got permissions, we're bringing in data, we could potentially, have an unwanted user set up a Codeless connector and hit connect. That's where, we can lock down through Enter ID, but at the same time, when it comes to securing the credentials, you can leverage things like secure strings and objects within the ARM template. These different options prevent the values of a string that you're going to be entering, such as credentials, from being shown either in the template or within the history. So within the ARM template itself, when you're defining these different parameters that Javier showed, like the client ID or the client secret or password or anything like that, you can specify them as type secure string or as type secure object to make them obfuscated and not show up. On the connection side of the Codeless connector, if you're looking to lock down, where the data is going to go and how it's getting there, this is where you can leverage private endpoints from Azure Monitor. So this is going to leverage the data collection endpoint and have it connect to an Azure Monitor private link scope, or AMPLS for short. This allows you to enable your network connections to be more secure, more private, hidden from the public eye. So this would just require that you set up a private link and connect the data collection endpoint to it as part of the scope. Other things to consider, you do not have to create one Codeless connector per log source. You can put multiple log sources or multiple tables into one Codeless connector. So that's part of the beauty of the current version. So that's just a matter of specifying multiple API endpoints, multiple schemas, and everything within a single ARM template and deploying it at once. You can find an example here with our Sophos endpoint protection Codeless connector. I'd recommend taking a look in the event that you have a Codeless connector you want to build for multiple log sources from a vendor. If you are a large organization or an MSSP and you want to potentially build and manage and roll out Codeless connectors through CI/CD, you do have a couple of options today through GitHub. So you can host your templates there and deploy them through GitHub. This would leverage out-of-box scripts that, in this case, the out-of-box script that might be provided through like the repositories feature of Microsoft Sentinel. Those scripts do not take into consideration Codeless connectors. So the ones that we provide for that feature set, those will not work on Codeless connectors. But you can build your own script. You can manually deploy them through a couple of button clicks in the README Markdown or via GitHub Actions. The same applies to Azure DevOps. You can host the templates within ADO or within another external repository and deploy them through pipelines in ADO. Any script that's provided out of box in ADO for repositories with Microsoft Sentinel, again, those scripts will not work on Codeless connectors. Lastly, Terraform, since Terraform supports ARM templates and deployments, you can make and manage your Codeless connectors through Terraform in this case, if that is what you prefer or what you're more experienced in. In terms of beginner guidance, at the start of the session, we talked about how this is a lot of information. It's very complex. It's very trial and error. And this is something I would say is like riding a bike or learning how to ride a bike. It's going to be a little rough at the start, but once you kind of get into the groove and understand it a bit more, it's going to be easier. So as a beginner, we recommend starting small and slowly add more features iteratively as you get more experience and more comfortable with the platform. So, in this case, a couple examples: start without pagination at the beginning, see if the connector works, set up a smaller table schema rather than having to try to build out the entire thing. You don't have to parameterize your template at first, if you want to statically define certain values just to make sure that it works or see where they pop up. And lastly, like parsing, if you don't need to parse to start, you don't have to. It's just kind of once you mature and build out a more final version, then you can start adding the parsing there. As you become more comfortable, we recommend using variables as much as possible within an ARM template that's going to be leveraged multiple times throughout the template. And you'll see that firsthand in the examples that we provide, that we specify a multitude of variables that are called throughout the template. We recommend also reviewing input and output tables for schemas to, in this case, to identify any mismatches. In the event that a schema does not match, you might run into issues where data does not ingest because the table doesn't know how to parse it properly or map the right columns to the right locations. And lastly, I would say the best way to learn is going to be by reverse engineering or referring to existing templates that we provide today within our GitHub repository. So go ahead and take a look at some of these examples, kind of get a feel for the structure, the look of it firsthand. Take into clone one and just swap out values for what you're trying to build. That's a great way to get started and get your hands on with the connector without starting from scratch. So with that, we're coming up on the end. So resources are available. We have the public docs for general information, REST API polar references, UI reference. We have some examples within the Microsoft Sentinel repository and GitHub that we recommend. And then lastly, if you missed out on part one of the series, go ahead and check out the link below. That's going to take you to the recorded session on YouTube, and you can watch as many times as you want there. So with that, I know that we're past time. Thank you all for attending. Thank you to those who had to leave. We appreciate you coming out in general. We'll stick around for a couple of minutes to answer questions in the Q&A, or if you want to come off of your microphone and ask questions, by all means, stick around and go ahead and we can have this discussion.
I see a question in the chat that says, how would you share a template out with others? Say we write a CCP for the community, would that ARM template need to be all-encompassing and include table names and schema of it? Yeah, you saw that when we defined the ARM template, you define the DCR, which contains the output table. You define the table as well, so it contains all those details. And you can just do a pull request to our Azure Sentinel GitHub repository. If you have a new template that you'd like to share with us, we'll be more than happy to review and approve if deemed necessary.
I see one that's tied to me. Does the Codeless Connector workbook help in creating Codeless Connector? Does it have any flaws or bugs? As the person who wrote it, there are some issues with it that I need to fix. It's just a matter of getting the availability to do it. So it can help with building Codeless connectors, but there are some issues that were pointed out that need to be addressed. So I would say for now, use the JSON template and the references that we posted, and then in the future, there will be an update that fixes the workbook, and it will hopefully work flawlessly.
So I see some questions, and maybe I explained that wrongly, because I see some questions about the UI only Codeless connector. That's not
those
option, right?
Those are from mine. Okay. So there were a couple questions about how do we build a Codeless connector for like Azure Diagnostic Logs where they don't show up in Microsoft Sentinel, or syslog where instead of dumping it all into syslog, they want to like show that they're bringing from a vendor. So what I was referring to is a quote UI only template where rather than building out the polling, the table and everything, you're just building a bare bones connector that shows up in the gallery. So it's going to be, the object for the connector. It's going to be the UI. It's going to be the instructions or the details to show that they're bringing it in. So it's not going to actually have any type of like polling or ingestion capabilities in that template. So sorry if I was confusing there. I'll make a note to have a UI specific either blog or example template in the GitHub repository.
I see a question about the links. The links will be in a PDF that will be posted also in our community. So you will have the presentation in PDF with the links. No time today for the GCP connector demo. I see another question. It's similar, and actually you can go now to the documentation, to our Sentinel documentation, and you will find already a sample and the different the reference for that. So yeah, GCP, and again we'll try to do a webinar in the next few weeks or months explaining more about GCP and AWS types. It's just that, as you can see, yes, with REST API we burned a lot of time. Okay, I think we went already way beyond the time, so I think we can close, Matt.
Sounds good to me.
Perfect.